How did they manage to drift off into dreamland when the wind was howling at -40 degrees and the ground was a slab of permafrost? The answer isn't a fluffy animal skin duvet or a high-tech sleeping bag, but a clever mix of body heat management, natural insulation, and a little bit of prehistoric engineering. First, the nighttime shelter itself was a crucial factor. Archaeologists have uncovered dozens of cave sites where Upper Paleolithic groups built shallow depressions in the floor, often lined with layers of broken bones, stones, and compacted moss. Those bone fragments weren't random debris. They acted like a primitive thermal mass. When the occupants curled up, their bodies warmed the bone layer, which then released the heat slowly throughout the night, reducing the temperature swing inside the sleeping pit. On top of that, people used what we would now call a blanket made from animal hides, fur, and, surprisingly, packed snow. Experiments in cold region ethnography show that a thick layer of fresh snow, compacted and covered with a hide, creates an air-filled pocket that insulates just as well as modern foam. The snow traps a thin layer of still air, preventing convection currents from whisking heat away. When the night warmed just a degree, the snow would melt slightly, then refreeze, maintaining the insulating barrier until sunrise. But insulation alone wasn't enough. The Ice Age diet, rich in protein and fat from mammoth, reindeer, and seal, provided abundant metabolic heat. Nighttime activity slowed, but even a modest increase in basal metabolic rate can generate enough internal warmth to keep core temperature stable when you're wrapped in a fur-lined hide. Sleep posture also mattered. Cave paintings and skeletal remains suggest they often slept in a fetal position, curling their bodies to minimize surface area exposed to the cold air. Some sites show evidence of communal sleeping, several individuals huddled together on a shared hide platform. The combined body heat of a small group can raise the microclimate by several degrees, a fact modern mountaineers still use in buddy sleeping. When the weather turned especially brutal, people would dig a shallow trench in the snow, line it with spruce bark or pine needles, and cover it with a thick hide roof. The trench acted like a trench bed, keeping the sleeping area below the wind-blown surface layer. In places like the Altai Mountains, researchers have found stone hearths placed just a meter away from the sleeping pit. The gentle radiative heat from the fire warmed the surrounding air without filling the space with smoke, which could have been lethal in a confined cave. All of these strategies, bone-lined pits, fur and snow blankets, communal huddling, and strategically placed hearths, show a sophisticated understanding of thermodynamics long before anyone wrote a physics textbook. Scientists believe these practices were passed down through generations, refined by trial and error. So the next time you pull a blanket over yourself on a cold night, remember, you're borrowing a technique that kept our ancestors alive in an age when a single night below zero could mean death. How could people keep going when the giant, shag-covered beasts that once filled the steppes simply stopped showing up? That is the question that haunts every archaeologist who looks at the last millennia of the Upper Paleolithic. And the answer is a lot more leafy than most of us imagined. When the mammoth herds retreated northward around 12,000 years ago, the hunters of Europe and Western Asia didn't all turn into starving nomads overnight. Instead, they turned their attention to the ground beneath their feet, to the roots, seeds, nuts, and wild greens that had been there all along. Stable isotope analysis of bone collagen from sites like Dolny Vestonis, Starchivo, and the Magdalenian caves of France shows a dramatic spike in carbon-13 and nitrogen-15 values that correspond to an increase in plant protein. In other words, the diet shifted from a 70–80% meat base to something closer to 50% plant matter. Microscopic wear on the teeth of late Paleolithic individuals, fine scratches and pits, matches the grinding of fibrous grasses and tubers, not just the tearing of meat. And let's not forget the evidence from stone tools. Many sites reveal a sudden proliferation of grinding stones, pestles, and mortars that were previously rare. What were they actually chewing on? In the steppe forest margins, wild wheat, barley, and rye species were abundant, though still untamed. The ancestors of today's hazelnuts and almonds provided high-calorie fats, while the seeds of grasses such as foxtail and sandbur were harvested by hand and roasted over low-heat embers. Roots of plants like wild carrot and the tubers of the edible sorrel were dug up with bone awls. Even the bark of certain trees, especially pine, was stripped, dried, and ground into a starchy flour that could be mixed with water and baked on hot stones. One of the most fascinating discoveries comes from the Yana rhinoceros horn site in Arctic Siberia. Researchers found charred remnants of a plant called saxifrage, a tiny cushion plant that thrives on cold, rocky outcrops. Its leaves were dried and pounded into a paste, likely used as a supplemental source of vitamins C and K, crucial for preventing scurvy when fresh meat was scarce. But it wasn't just about calories. The plant diet helped balance the hunter's nutrition. Vitamin-rich greens supplied essential micronutrients that meat lacks: iron, magnesium, and especially vitamin C, which modern studies show can be obtained from raw or lightly cooked wild greens. Moreover, the fiber from roots and seeds aided digestion and helped prevent intestinal parasites that thrive on protein-heavy meals. The shift also had social implications. Gathering plants required groups to spread out over larger areas, often in mixed-sex parties, which may have fostered new patterns of cooperation and information exchange. The appearance of storage pits and the careful layering of plant remains in hearths suggest that they began to cache surplus roots for the leaner months, an early form of food preservation that would later blossom into true agriculture. So, when the mammoths vanished, the people didn't simply disappear. They turned to the Earth's pantry, mastering the art of plant processing, grinding, and storage. Their secret plant-based diet kept their bodies fueled, their families fed, and their cultures alive, setting the stage for the next great leap, the domestication of those very crops they had been gathering for millennia. How did Ice Age hunters manage to keep a flame alive while crossing a 20-kilometer expanse of powdery snow, where any spark would be snuffed out by the wind? The answer lies in a surprisingly clever piece of technology that archaeologists call the portable charcoal backpack, a simple yet effective solution that allowed our ancestors to carry fire through the harshest winter routes. The first clue comes from a series of sites in the Altai Mountains and the Siberian taiga, where researchers have uncovered clusters of finely broken charcoal, each piece wrapped in layers of birch bark and animal hide. The charcoal itself was produced months earlier, when a group built a low, well-ventilated fire pit in a sheltered hollow. By feeding the flames slowly and allowing the wood to char without turning to ash, they created dense, black carbon that could burn for hours at a low temperature. Because charcoal contains far less moisture than fresh wood, it stays hot and smolders even when the outer layers are insulated. To transport it, Ice Age peoples fashioned a small backpack from woven grass or split bark panels, then lined the interior with a thick skin pouch. Inside the pouch, they placed the charcoal chunks, and on top they added a layer of dry moss, followed by a thin sheet of animal hide. The hide acted like a wind-proof blanket, while the moss absorbed any stray sparks and prevented the charcoal from igniting the surrounding material. When the group needed a fire, say, to melt snow for water or to signal a distant camp, they would carefully open the pouch, expose a few charcoal pieces, and give them a gentle puff of breath. The smoldering ember would flare into a small, steady flame that could be fed with dry twigs or pine resin. Experimental archaeology has shown that this method can keep a usable ember alive for up to 3 days, even in temperatures as low as -30 degrees Celsius. Modern volunteers who recreated the backpack using authentic materials reported that the combination of insulation and controlled airflow allowed the charcoal to stay hot enough to reignite a fire without any external fuel. Moreover, the backpack's design meant that a single individual could carry enough charcoal for an entire party of 10, reducing the need for multiple fire-making stations along the route. Why was this necessary? During the last glacial maximum, many hunting routes crossed open tundra and high-altitude passes where wood was scarce. A group could travel 20 kilometers in a day, but without a reliable source of fire, they would be forced to stop, expose themselves to predators, or risk hypothermia. The portable charcoal backpack thus became a crucial logistic tool, much like a modern camping stove, enabling hunters to maintain warmth, cook meat, and keep their tools dry while moving across the frozen landscape. Scientists believe this practice was widespread among both Neanderthals and early modern humans, as similar charcoal caches have been found from Spain to Siberia. While the exact shape of the backpack varied, some used woven willow strips, others used sewn fur pouches. The core principle remains the same. Preserve a smoldering ember in an insulated, wind-proof container, and you have a portable, reusable source of fire that can survive a 20-kilometer trek across a snowfield. This ingenious adaptation shows that even in the most unforgiving environments, our ancestors relied on clever engineering rather than brute force to stay alive. How could a hunter-gatherer who just sliced his thigh on a stone spear survive an infection when there were no pills, no hospitals, no sterile dressings? The answer, as surprising as it sounds, was right in the ground and the beehives they stumbled upon. Archaeologists working at Upper Paleolithic sites in the Zagros Mountains have found fragments of fired clay placed deliberately on the inner surfaces of cave shelters, and microscopic analysis shows those pieces are coated with a thin film of plant resin and honey. Scientists believe the clay acted as a primitive sponge that could be moistened with honey or fermented sap, and then pressed onto a wound to absorb blood, dead tissue, and, most importantly, bacteria. Honey, as we now know, is a natural antiseptic. Its low water activity, high acidity, and the presence of hydrogen peroxide create an environment where microbes struggle to thrive. Even a handful of wild honey, harvested from stone-cut hives, would have been enough to cover a deep cut and keep it from rotting. Experimental archaeology has demonstrated that honey-soaked cloth can halt the growth of Staphylococcus and Clostridium species for weeks, and ethnographic records from the Andaman Islands and Siberian reindeer herders still describe honey as a first aid remedy. When honey or resin ran out, the Paleolithic people turned to what they had in abundance: earth. Certain clays, especially those rich in kaolinite or iron oxide, have mild antimicrobial properties. A small lump of moist clay could be molded around a limb and then left to dry, forming a hard, protective shell. This stone bandage not only sealed the wound from dirt and parasites, but also applied gentle, constant pressure, slowing bleeding and limiting swelling. Evidence for this practice comes from the wear patterns on stone tools that show repeated scraping of soft, compacted material, and from the presence of tiny carbonized plant fibers embedded in the clay, likely remnants of shredded bark used to bind the material in place. In the caves of Lascaux and Goyet, researchers have uncovered tiny stone fragments with a faint reddish hue that matches the mineral composition of local ochre-rich clays, suggesting they were deliberately shaped into splints or bandage plates. So when a deep wound threatened to become a death sentence, our ancestors didn't sit around waiting for a miracle. They combined the antibacterial power of honey, the absorptive and mildly antiseptic qualities of clay, and the mechanical support of stone or bark splints. It was a crude, yet surprisingly effective, medical toolkit forged from the very landscape that kept them alive. How could a tribe that spent most of its day hunting woolly mammoths and gathering frost-bitten roots possibly afford to keep anyone who could no longer run, lift a spear, or carry a heavy load? The answer is that older people were not a burden at all. They were a crucial piece of the survival puzzle, and the evidence from dozens of Paleolithic sites shows that grandparents were deliberately cared for, not abandoned. First, the knowledge bank that elders carried was priceless. When a hunter-gatherer group moved across a landscape that changed with each season, remembering the exact location of a hidden spring, the safest route through a crevasse-filled valley, or the timing of a caribou migration could mean the difference between a full belly and a week of starvation. Archaeologists have found stone tools with wear patterns that match teaching activities. For example, a cluster of finely retouched scrapers near a hearth that is dated to a period when younger adults were still learning the subtleties of hide preparation. Experiments with modern foragers confirm that passing on these tacit skills takes years of observation and correction, something only a patient, experienced adult can provide. Second, elders acted as social glue. In many Ice Age sites, such as the burial grounds at Dolní Věstonice in the Czech Republic, we see multiple generations buried together, suggesting that families stayed together for life. Anthropologists argue that older members helped mediate disputes, enforce group norms, and allocate food fairly during lean times. When a sudden blizzard cut off a hunting party, the collective memory of past storms stored in the stories older people recited around the fire guided younger hunters in building windbreaks and conserving heat. This kind of cultural continuity reduced the risk of internal conflict, which can be deadly in a small, isolated band. Third, there is a direct reproductive benefit. Grandparents, especially grandmothers, increase the survival rate of grandchildren. Ethnographic studies of contemporary hunter-gatherers, like the Hadza of Tanzania, show that children whose grandmothers are present have a 20 to 30% higher chance of reaching adulthood. The extra hands mean more food can be collected, infants can be nursed longer, and sick children receive more care. In the archaeological record, we see that older women often lived to 60 or 70, far beyond the average life expectancy of 30 to 35 for their peers, suggesting that they were receiving enough nutrition and protection to stay alive long enough to help raise the next generation. Finally, the presence of elders may have helped buffer the group against disease. Older individuals who survived previous outbreaks often carried antibodies that younger members had not yet developed. While we cannot directly test ancient immune systems, the pattern of intergenerational burial and the lack of mass mortality spikes in some sites hint that groups with strong elder care experienced fewer catastrophic die-offs. So when you picture a frostbitten camp at night, don't just see a circle of hunters huddled around a fire. Imagine the quiet corner where a wizened man, his skin cracked from the wind, is pointing out the best place to set a snare, while a grandmother hums a lullaby that carries the memory of a summer river that will soon thaw. Their stories weren't entertainment. They were a living manual for staying alive in a world where every night could be the last. The science is clear. Keeping the story keepers alive was not an act of kindness, it was an evolutionary strategy that helped the whole tribe endure the harshest Ice Age winters. How did they keep the snarling cave lion from turning their nighttime shelter into a blood-spattered mess? The answer isn't a single magic trick, but a toolbox of low-tech tactics that combined fire, smoke, simple traps, and a rotating night watch. First, fire was the most reliable guardian. Archaeologists have found hearth pits lined with stone at dozens of Upper Paleolithic sites, and charcoal layers indicate that the flames burned continuously through the coldest months. The heat itself was a deterrent. Large cats dislike the intense, uneven heat of an open flame, but more important was the smoke. When a fire smoldered low, the rising plume filled the entrance of a cave or the opening of a temporary lean to shelter, creating a thick, acrid curtain that masked human scent and made it difficult for a lion to locate a prey-like target. Experimental reconstructions at the University of York showed that a steady stream of pine smoke can reduce a big cat's willingness to approach by up to 70%. When fire and smoke weren't enough, hunters set simple pit traps near the camp's perimeter. These were shallow depressions lined with sharpened sticks, covered lightly with branches and leaves. A lion stepping into the hidden hole would be impaled, or at least immobilized long enough for the night watchers to intervene. Evidence of such traps comes from wear patterns on stone tools and from the occasional discovery of a single broken lion tooth lodged in a wooden fragment at sites like Dolny Vestonis. But the most human element of protection was the night shift. Ethnographic analogs from modern hunter-gatherer societies show that groups would assign a few members, often the strongest men or seasoned hunters, to stay awake near the fire while the rest slept in a tight circle. These night guards kept a keen eye on the flickering shadows and were ready to shout, wave a torch, or throw a stone at any approaching predator. Their presence alone altered the risk calculus for a cave lion. A solitary cat prefers stealth, not a confrontation with a vigilant human group. Finally, they used scent masking strategies. After a hunt, the meat was often hung near the fire, and the resulting blood and grease were washed away with water from nearby streams. This reduced the olfactory cues that could attract a predator. In some sites, residues of animal fat mixed with ash suggest that people deliberately smeared the fire's edges with animal oil, creating a pungent barrier that lions found unappealing. All these methods, continuous fire, smoke screens, pit traps, rotating night watches, and scent management, work together like a primitive security system. The result wasn't foolproof, but it gave Paleolithic peoples a fighting chance to keep the cave lions at bay and sleep a little more soundly under the cold, star-strewn sky. How did a newborn survive the first breath of a world where the temperature outside the cave could plunge to minus 30 degrees, and the only light was a flickering fire that seemed to struggle against the wind? The answer lies in a combination of clever use of the cave's natural microclimate, communal knowledge passed down through generations, and a handful of practical tricks that ancient midwives perfected long before anyone invented a hospital. First, the choice of birthing spot was anything but random. Archaeologists have identified shallow depressions in the floor of many Upper Paleolithic shelters that are lined with layers of compacted moss, animal skins, and, crucially, a thin blanket of insulating snow that never fully melted inside the cave. Those deposits acted like a natural thermal mat, keeping the ground temperature several degrees warmer than the surrounding air. By laying the mother on this ice-soft platform, the heat generated by her body and the fire could be trapped, reducing heat loss through conduction. Next, the fire itself was positioned strategically. Instead of a roaring central hearth, the fire was kept low and close to the birthing area, often in a stone-lined pit that reflected heat upward. Charcoal embers were spread in a thin layer on a stone slab, creating a gentle, radiant warmth that could be adjusted by adding or removing ash. Experiments with replica Paleolithic shelters show that such a setup can maintain an ambient temperature of around 5 to 10 degrees Celsius even when the outside is well below freezing, enough to keep a newborn's core temperature stable for the first crucial hours. Midwives also employed skin wrapping techniques that are astonishingly similar to modern swaddling. After the baby emerged, they would quickly cover it with a series of layers. First a thin, damp goat skin to provide an immediate barrier against the cold, then a dry, fur-lined cloak to lock in heat. The damp layer acted like a primitive thermal blanket, using the latent heat of evaporation to moderate temperature spikes, while the outer fur prevented wind chill. In some sites, archaeologists have found tiny perforations in bone fragments that suggest the use of hollowed-out antler tubes or bone tubes as makeshift warm water bottles, filled with hot water from the fire and placed against the infant's chest. Pain management and infection prevention were also part of the ritual. Evidence from cut marks on mammoth ivory shows that ancient people fashioned sharp, polished tools for precise incisions, minimizing tissue damage. They also applied a paste made from ground birch bark, rich in tannins and antimicrobial compounds, directly to the umbilical stump. This paste not only helped the cord to dry quickly, but also reduced the risk of bacterial infection, a crucial factor when medical help was a handful of neighbors at best. Finally, the social structure of the group played a vital role. Midwives were rarely solitary. A small birth circle of experienced women gathered around, providing warmth, physical support, and importantly, keeping watch for predators. The collective body heat of several adults huddled together could raise the microclimate by several degrees, creating a protective bubble of warmth that lasted until the mother and child were strong enough to move deeper into the cave or into a shelter built from packed earth and stone. All of these practices, careful site selection, strategic fire placement, layered swaddling, natural antiseptics, and communal warmth, are supported by a growing body of archaeological and experimental data. While we can't watch a Paleolithic birth in real time, the convergence of cave geology, tool wear patterns, and ethnographic parallels with modern hunter-gatherer societies gives us a vivid picture of how ancient midwives turned frozen stone chambers into safe birthing rooms, even when the world outside was a raging -30-degree freezer. How did people living under an ice-capped sky keep the deadly bugs at bay when modern medicine didn't even exist? The short answer is, they didn't have vaccines in the way we think of them, but they did practice a handful of surprisingly sophisticated tricks that lowered the odds of infections spreading through their tight-knit bands. First, there is solid archaeological evidence that many Upper Paleolithic groups deliberately exposed their youngsters to low-level pathogens. Skeletons from the Magdalenian sites in southern France show healed lesions on the ribs and pelvis of children who survived what looks like recurrent respiratory infections. Researchers think elders, who had already survived multiple harsh winters, would take a sick infant or toddler into a sheltered fire pit, letting the child breathe the warm, slightly smoky air for hours. The smoke contains volatile compounds, phenols, formaldehyde, even tiny amounts of antimicrobial ash that can reduce bacterial load in the upper airways. Over time, the child's immune system learns to recognize the most common cave-borne microbes, a process modern scientists call trained immunity. Second, the ancient herb stash tells a parallel story. Charred remains of yarrow, wild garlic, and the bitter root of greater celandine have been recovered from hearths across the Altai and the Pyrenees. When ground into a paste and applied to wounds, these plants release flavonoids and alkaloids that inhibit bacterial growth. Ethnographic analogs from Siberian reindeer herders show they would boil these herbs into a thin tea and sip it during the cold season, essentially giving themselves a daily dose of antimicrobial agents. Finally, social rules acted like a primitive quarantine. When a member of a band showed signs of a severe respiratory illness, persistent cough, fever, or a foul-smelling wound, others would isolate the sick in a separate side cave or a dugout shelter, often with a fire at the entrance to keep predators away, but also to dry the air. This reduced the density of airborne droplets, slowing the spread much like a modern isolation ward. All of these practices, controlled exposure to smoke, regular use of medicinal herbs, and community-wide isolation protocols were not vaccines in the laboratory sense, but they formed a low-tech, evidence-based defense against the invisible enemies of the Ice Age. In the harsh world of stone tools and mammoth hides, the best medicine was a combination of nature's chemistry and the collective wisdom passed down by the very elders who survived the longest, coldest winters.